Who are the young, black, queer trailblazers that your kids already know, but you don't? They're not just making headlines. They're redefining pride, identity, and freedom on their own terms. If you thought Gen Z was soft, think again. Because these 10 voices, they're louder than any law. Lil Nas X. Okay, let's talk about someone who's not just out, but out loud. You know who I'm talking about, Lil Nas X. When Old Town Road exploded in 2019, most people saw a catchy country song with a cowboy hat and a few memes. But what they didn't expect was that Montero Lamar Hill, a young, gay black man, would use that attention to make history. While the song was at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 for a record-breaking 19 weeks, he tweeted something simple that shocked the world. He was gay. No press release, no interview, just pure Gen Z honesty. "Deadass think I'm out," he wrote, along with a rainbow emoji and a link to his lyrics. And just like that, a star was born again, but this time on his own. Now let me ask you, how many black male artists in mainstream music have done that at their peak? The answer is almost zero. Especially in hip-hop, where coming out is still viewed with suspicion, silence, or even homophobia. But Lil Nas X doesn't care. He dares to be gay and successful, to be black and gay without shame. And he doesn't ask anyone for permission. Then there's Montero, Call Me By Your Name, and it's amazing. If you haven't seen that video, watch it right after this one. He pole dances to hell and strip teases to Satan, not to shock, but to reclaim power from trauma. He says, if you grow up being told you're going to hell for who you are, then go be proud. It wasn't a performance, it was a cultural reset. But you know what makes Lil Nas X truly special? He didn't stop at shock. He used it to start conversations. Honest conversations. He consistently spoke up for LGBTQ+ youth, especially queer black kids who felt invisible. In 2021, the Trevor Project named him Suicide Prevention Advocate of the Year. Why? Because he talks about the hard stuff. He publicly tweeted about his own struggles with depression and suicidal thoughts as a teenager. Not to get sympathy, but to let others know they weren't alone. He also spoke out against anti-LGBTQ+ legislation, specifically targeting politicians who pushed "don't say gay" laws or transgender bans. On Twitter, on stage, even in interviews, he calls them out. He's not here to keep safe, he's here to protect the next generation. And don't forget his fashion, because every red carpet he walks is a protest wrapped in glamour. Pink Versace suits, beaded dresses, gold armor, no shame, no boundaries, just freedom. And honestly, it's contagious. So if you're watching this and wondering if just being yourself is ever enough, remember, Lil Nas X doesn't fit in. He stands out. And in doing so, he's made space for everyone who's ever been told they're too much to finally feel like they're enough. So he stood on the world's biggest stage and spoke the truth, not just to himself, but to all the children who were silently watching. But what if revolution didn't always come with fire and thunder? What if it came from silence, curiosity, and a quiet refusal to be constrained? Let's keep going, because the next story, it just might surprise you. Willow Smith. Have you ever met someone who exudes calm? Like, they don't have to raise their voice, wear flashy clothes, or prove anything, but as soon as they walk into the room, the energy changes? That's Willow Smith. And I mean that in the most beautiful, honest way possible. Now, you might think that being the daughter of Will Smith and Jada Pinkett means you're born famous. Sure, but Willow? She didn't inherit the spotlight, she redefined it. From her early days in Whip My Hair to now, she's gone from a pop culture curiosity to a symbol of self-esteem, especially for queer and black Gen Z kids who are fed up with being told who they should be. Let me tell you, her coming out wasn't on a magazine cover or a viral stunt. It was on Red Table Talk, sitting between her mother and grandmother, simply speaking her truth. "I love men and women equally," she said without hesitation. "I can imagine myself with a man and a woman at the same time." And the most powerful thing? There was no shock, no applause, just the truth held comfortably. And that honesty? It creates a ripple effect. Because when you see someone speak their truth so naturally, you start to believe that you can do the same. But Willow didn't stop there. She didn't just come out, she showed up. She showed up for the queer community with a purpose. Back in 2021, she worked with the It Gets Better project during Pride Month, sharing stories of growth, pain, and healing. That same year, she told Billboard that difference is sacred and that young people need the space to explore, to feel, to exist without fear. That's not just rhetoric, that's leadership. Her fashion? Versatile. Her music? Unapologetically. Her energy? Healing. Songs like Transparent Soul and Curious Furious aren't just hits, they're meditations on self-identity, belonging, and the space between labels. Willow invites you to question everything, including the stereotypes society places around gender, love, and identity. She's unabashedly queer, just present, just powerful. And let's talk about mental health for a moment, because Willow has been incredibly open about her struggles with anxiety, self-harm, and the pressure to always be strong. And when a young Black woman says, "I'm struggling, and I'm still healing," it breaks the silence of a generation. It's activism, it's presence. It's a kind of freedom that not only frees her, but also frees others. You know what else I love about her? She's so steadfast and quiet. You'll find her attending queer art exhibitions, supporting trans creators, and using her platform to spread power to others, not just herself. She doesn't post rainbows just 1 month a year. She lives that love every day, and in a world obsessed with noise, her gentleness is revolutionary in and of itself. So if Lil Nas X represents the explosiveness and flashiness of Gen Z queerness, Willow is the air, calm, steady, everywhere at once. Not everyone needs to shout to be heard. Some people just need to be seen, felt, and remembered. And Willow? She's unforgettable, precisely because she never tried to be. Amandla Stenberg. Talk about courage, not the kind that comes in capes or headlines, but the kind that looks like a teenage girl standing up to a system that's much older, whiter, and louder than her, and refusing to back down. That's Amandla Stenberg. And if you don't know her, trust me, you should. You might remember her as Rue in The Hunger Games, the girl whose death broke us all. But Amandla didn't just grow up in Hollywood. She became a voice, the bold, queer, unapologetic Black voice that this generation desperately needs. She came out as bisexual in 2016 in a video for Teen Vogue, not for attention, but for connection. "I am a Black bisexual woman, and I'm happy to say it," she said. That moment was so important, because how often do we see Black queer women in the spotlight, owning their truth without shame, without hiding? Not often. But Amandla doesn't wait for permission. She creates space. And she's not afraid to speak up. While most stars are playing it safe, Amandla is here giving a TED Talk about cultural appropriation and calling out racism in fashion and music. She's not angry, she's sober. She once turned down a role in Black Panther because she felt her light skin didn't represent the authenticity of the story. Think about it. Turning down a Marvel paycheck for integrity? That's rare, but powerful. But back to queerness, because Amandla's journey has been amazing. In 2018, she came out again, this time as queer, sharing how falling in love with a woman finally helped her understand her own gender identity. And she didn't stop at labels. She spoke about the intersection of queerness with race, power, and self-esteem. It's not just about who you love, but how you see yourself in the world. Her role in The Hate U Give was a powerful lesson in emotional truth. And behind the scenes, she's used her platform to elevate Black trans voices, speak out about LGBTQ+ mental health, and advocate for inclusive education. She's worked with organizations like GLSEN, supported queer youth centers, and used interviews not to promote herself, but to remind people that softness isn't weakness. That Black girls can be queer, poetic, and strong. And let's be honest, her style? Iconic, gender fluid, fearless, emotional. From her shaved head to her dreamy red carpet suits, Amandla doesn't dress for approval. She dresses like she's dreaming. And for a lot of queer kids watching, that's the dream, to walk in the world as exactly who you are. So the question is, how can we create space for others to be free if we were never taught to be free ourselves? Amandla's answer? You have to unlearn. You have to speak up. You risk being misunderstood, but you keep going. Because visibility is never the goal. Liberation is. Kynan Lonsdale. Let's be real. Coming out is hard, but coming out while dancing in gold, singing Kiss the Boy, and telling the world that you finally feel alive? That takes more than courage. It takes joy. And that's exactly what Kynan Lonsdale brings to the LGBTQ+ world. Joy, color, and freedom that makes you want to get up and dance too. You might know him as Kid Flash on The Flash, or as the dreamy Bram on Love, Simon. But in real life, Kynan is rewriting what it means to live life to the fullest, especially for queer people of color. He came out in 2017, but instead of putting out a glossy press release, he wrote an honest, emotional Instagram post about self-love, healing, and letting go of fear. And that's how you know he's not just present. He was intentional, and he didn't stop at a social media moment. He turned it into a movement. After coming out, he began releasing music that was not only catchy, but transformative. Preach, Gay Street Fighter, Rainbow Dragon, these weren't just songs, they were statements. They were battle cries and love letters wrapped into one. And his music videos? Bold, unabashedly queer, full of melanin, magic, and meaning. He created worlds where gay black men not only existed, but thrived. Kynan once said, "My queerness is my power, and you can see it in everything he does." Whether it's strutting down the red carpet in a lace dress or kissing a co-star on stage, every gesture is a deliberate rejection. For many fans who have never seen themselves reflected in pop culture, Kynan has become a mirror, shining, soft, and powerful. But this is where that power gets even stronger. He doesn't just go through the motions. He's used his platform to speak up for queer youth, mental health, gender liberation, and racial justice. During the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, he showed up, not just physically, but emotionally, to remind fans that joy and activism can go hand in hand. He's also supported campaigns to support LGBTQ+ homeless shelters and donated his music's proceeds to queer-led community movements. He spread the values of other queer artists, collaborated with trans and non-binary creators, and refused to center spaces that were supposed to be shared. And here's something you might not know. Kynan has become a quiet mentor to emerging artists, especially those who feel like their identity makes them too much for the industry. He's known for DMing young creatives words of encouragement, reposting their work, or simply reminding them that vulnerability is a form of strength. In interviews, he doesn't give polished speeches. He speaks with an honesty that's both messy and beautiful, reminding us that healing is an ongoing process. And your story doesn't have to be perfect to be powerful. So maybe that's the real magic of Kynan Lonsdale. He doesn't stand on stage and say, "Be like me." He looks into the camera and says, "You are enough. Let's grow together." And if there's one thing we can learn from him, it's this. You don't have to wait for the world to be ready to love you. You can start by loving yourself. Loudly, colorfully, and imperfectly. Just like Kynan. Yasmin Finney. Okay, let's get real. Have you ever met someone who not only exists in the world, but changes it? That's exactly what Yasmin Finney is doing. And no, I'm not just talking about red carpets and Netflix fame. I'm talking about something much deeper. I'm talking about how this black trans girl from Manchester is rewriting what it means to grow up, to be seen, and to belong. Yasmin didn't start in Hollywood. She started on TikTok. It was just her, a phone, and a text message that woke people up. She talks about being misgendered in school, navigating the world in a body that people didn't always understand, and still finding joy. Still laughing, still dreaming. And I know some of you watching this can relate to that. Feeling invisible, feeling misunderstood. That's why her voice matters. It made people feel less alone. And then she broke through. She landed the role of Elle in Heartstopper, and suddenly she wasn't just talking to her followers, she was talking to the world. And get this, Elle isn't a side character. She's not a tragedy, she's the heart. She's loved, and she's alive. For so many queer kids, especially Black trans girls, it was the first time they saw someone who looked like them in a story that celebrated them. But Yasmin didn't stop at showing up. She acted with purpose. She used her platform to speak up for trans rights, for Black lives, for kids who were bullied for being different. She marched at Trans Plus Pride in London, not just as a celebrity, but as a sister, a daughter, a warrior. She said loud and clear, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." You see, when someone like Yasmin steps forward, she opens the door for others to come in. That's leadership. That's legacy. She's not trying to be perfect, she's trying to be authentic. And in doing that, she's allowed thousands of people to stop hiding and start living. And now, she's making history again, joining the cast of Doctor Who as the first Black trans woman in the series. Do you know how big that is? A show that's been around for 60 years is finally making room for someone like her. It's not just a victory for her, it's a victory for all of us. So here's my question to you. Yes, you watching this. What does presence mean to you? Who would you be if you stopped shrinking to fit other people's expectations? Because Yasmin didn't wait for the world to be ready. She showed up, and that courage, that bold, unapologetic joy, it was contagious. Maybe you're not ready to share your story, and that's okay, but I hope you know you don't have to be famous to make a difference. You just have to be yourself, fully, proudly, fearlessly. And if Yasmin Finney can make her truth the center of attention, then maybe, just maybe, you can too. Justice Smith. You know what I've learned as I've watched this generation rise? It's that visibility isn't just about being seen. It's about seeing others and supporting them on their journey. And when I think about that, I think of Justice Smith. He's not just another young Hollywood actor taking on roles in big movies like Jurassic World, Paper Towns, or Detective Pikachu. Justice did something that takes real courage in this space. He came out, loudly, publicly, and with purpose. In 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protests, he didn't just show up, he stood arm in arm with his boyfriend in the crowd, chanting, marching, fighting. And in doing so, he made a bold, unabashed statement that queer Black lives matter. Now pause for a moment. That moment, it really mattered. Because here was a young Black man in Hollywood, handsome, talented, with everything to lose, who chose to use his platform not just for himself, but for us. For every gay kid sitting at home wondering if he'd ever be loved and celebrated at the same time. Justice showed them that. No ambiguity, no coded language, no waiting for someone else to do it first, just the truth. But Justice didn't stop at coming out. He used his voice to amplify what so many others were afraid to say, that Black queer people are often invisible, even in movements that are supposed to protect them. He spoke honestly about the lack of intersectional representation in Hollywood, about the pressure to choose between your Black identity and your gay identity, as if you couldn't be both, about how exhausting it is to constantly explain your identity to people who want to fit you into boxes you never agreed with. And he did all of this, not with bitterness, but with hope. With this quiet strength, he said, "I understand what's wrong, and I believe we can do better." Justice became a bridge between communities, between generations, between the silence of the past and the roar of the future. And importantly, he wasn't trying to be anyone's savior. He was just being himself. Messy, human, authentic. And that was his power. Because when he posted a picture with his partner, or shared his thoughts on representation in an interview, or simply existed in a world where he shouldn't have, he was sowing something, a seed in the mind of someone watching the film who has yet to find his courage. And perhaps that is what makes Justice so unforgettable. Not the roles he has played, but the role he is playing in real life, a role that doesn't end when the camera stops rolling, a role that invites others to live their truth, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. So let me share this with you. What kind of world do you want to help build? Because if Justice teaches us anything, it's that every little act of authenticity matters. And when we show up fully, unrepentantly, and empathetically, we don't just change our own story, we change others too. Taylor Bennett. Hey, have you ever met someone whose presence is quietly courageous? Someone who doesn't need fireworks to change the culture, just a microphone and the courage to speak his truth? That's Taylor Bennett to me. Most people still introduce him as Chance the Rapper's little brother. And sure, technically he is. But let's be real, Taylor is forging a path that's entirely his own. And what is he doing along the way? It's not just music. It's representation. It's presence. It's a quiet revolution that says you can be yourself and still belong in hip-hop. Back in 2017, Taylor made a move that few rap artists have been brave enough to make. He came out as bisexual just days before his new mixtape dropped. No subtle hints, no cryptic lyrics, just a tweet. Straightforward, honest, powerful. I am a bisexual man and I am proud of it. That moment, it didn't just open a door. It also cracked open an invisible wall for a lot of young black gay fans who had been holding their breath waiting for someone like themselves to speak up. And Taylor didn't stop there. He kept building. He started using his music to talk about identity, masculinity, and love. Not in a preachy way, but in a conversational way. When you hear songs like Be Yourself, you're not just vibing to a beat. You're hearing someone being true to themselves. You're hearing pride, not just the colors of the rainbow, but the pride that comes from surviving, thriving, and not shrinking. But here's something I think gets less talked about. Taylor doesn't make being gay his entire brand. He just lives it. It's in his interviews, his photos, his lyrics. It's in his person, not just a PR stunt. That kind of authenticity, it's rare, especially in an industry that still dismisses gay artists, especially black men, as soon as they step outside the mold. And perhaps what makes his story even more powerful is how his family showed up. His relationship with Chance was beautiful. When Taylor came out, Chance wasn't distant or silent. He honored his brother. He showed up, time and time again, with love, support, and no hesitation. In a culture where black masculinity is so constricted, that kind of brotherly allyship, it's a model for how we change things from the inside out. What I find incredible is that Taylor isn't chasing the mainstream spotlight, yet he's influencing people who've never even heard a song of his. His courage is more powerful than the numbers on the charts. He's not waiting for permission to be accepted in hip-hop. He's carving out his own space and inviting others to join in. Every interview, every stage, every lyric is a gentle reminder that being queer is not a barrier to creativity. It's part of the energy. And if you're someone who's watching this and has ever felt like you had to choose between truth and talent, between being authentic and being accepted, Taylor Bennett is living proof that you don't have to split yourself in two. You can occupy the space exactly as you are. Completely. Loud, soft, artistic, political, beautiful. Because maybe the real message behind Taylor's music and identity isn't just about pride or fame. It's about legacy. About leaving behind a world that the next generation feels can be a little better. And I think that's something we can all carry with us. Kid Ken. If you've ever scrolled through one of his TikTok videos or caught a glimpse of him performing in a crop top and heels while belting out tunes that are more exciting than half the games, stop and rewind. That's Kid Ken. And no, he's not just a famous rapper. He's a movement, a challenge, a true rebellion wrapped in pink hair and fierce raps. Let's rewind a bit. Born Dontrell Smith on Chicago's South Side, Kid Ken didn't grow up in a world that made space for someone like him. Not on the streets, not in school, and certainly not in the music industry. But here's the interesting thing. He didn't wait for space. He created it. Loud, bold, and flashy. He didn't wait for the right time to come out or try to fit in. He came into the world as himself and made sure people saw him, even if they didn't understand him. He was rapping at a young age, he was performing, he was dreaming big, and honestly, being a black, openly gay teenager, making his mark in the macho world of hip-hop, that's not just brave, it's revolutionary. You can feel that energy in every line of his songs. Just listen to Moves or Bougie Fellow. He didn't hide, he didn't code switch, he didn't water down anything for comfort. His lyrics were bold, raw, smart, and they spoke directly to queer kids who had never seen anyone like them take the mic with such confidence. And that's the magic of Kid Ken. He makes it look so easy, but we all know that it takes courage to cover up wounds and confidence to build over years of rejection. And you know what's wild? He's still very young, but he's performed at the BET Awards, received praise from industry veterans, and created a space that didn't exist before him. Not just as an LGBTQ+ artist, but as a Black queer icon in the making. Have you ever seen someone and thought, holy shit, they're gonna change everything? That's the feeling Kid Ken brings. Every time he walks into a room or onto a stage, he brings an electric energy that rewrites the rules just by showing up. But make no mistake, it hasn't been easy. There are still people who make fun of him. There are still people who question his right to be in the room. There are still trolls hiding behind screens calling him names they would never dare say. And yet, he shows up, over and over again, not just for himself, but for every queer kid who's ever been told to sit down and shut up. Now tell me, how many openly queer rappers can you name who are being taken seriously in mainstream hip-hop right now? Exactly. That's why Kid Ken matters. He's here. He's gorgeous. He raps for almost half the game, and he's not going anywhere. That's not just fame, that's power. That's not just pride, that's prophecy. My Holla Herald. There's something about My Holla Herald that grabs your attention. Maybe it's the piercing gaze, the sharp tone of her voice, or the way she can go from fierce to vulnerable in the blink of an eye. But one thing's for sure. Once you see her on screen, you'll never forget her. You may have seen her on Industry, the tense, suspenseful HBO drama, as Harper Stern, a Black, queer American woman struggling in the cutthroat world of London finance. It's not a role you see every day. And maybe that's the point. Because My Holla didn't come here to fit in. She came here to stand out, and she does it with a rare kind of courage. It's refreshing. It's necessary. Born in California and raised by a single mother she calls her best friend, My Holla grew up with a deep sense of the value of independence. She took drama seriously, worked hard, and even shaved her head at one point. Not for show, but because she wanted to feel whole, free from any notion of beauty or femininity. And then there's this. My Holla is unabashedly queer. She doesn't shroud her identity in mystery or express it through carefully crafted cliches designed to attract public attention. She names it, lives it, wears it, in interviews, in roles, in the way she moves through the world. And honestly, it shows. She exudes an underlying strength. You don't feel like she's acting confident. She's confident because she knows who she is and what she brings to the table. And this is where it gets personal. For so many young queer women of color who watch her on screen, My Holla represents a rare breed. Not just in terms of representation, but in the depth she brings to her characters. Her Harper is imperfect. She's messy, brilliant, flawed, human. And for audiences used to bland, one-dimensional roles, that kind of authenticity feels different. It makes people feel seen. What's more, My Holla isn't trying to fit into the Hollywood mold, she's breaking it. Whether she's criticizing showboating in interviews or refusing to straighten her hair for roles, she's fighting for something bigger than fame. She's fighting for change. And it's not loud, showy performance. It's thoughtful, intentional, personal. It's powerful. Sometimes when the industry talks about gay celebrities, it's all rainbow flags and Pride Month cliches. But My Holla? She's the real deal. She's not here to be your role model. She's here to tell real stories and create space for others to do the same. Watch her closely, because she's not just building a career, she's building a future. Aaron Phillip. Let's close out this powerful list with someone who truly redefines what it means to be bold in a world that doesn't include you. Aaron Phillip isn't just the last name on our list. She's a force, a movement, a living story of what happens when one person refuses to be erased. Born in Antigua and raised in the Bronx, Aaron came into this world straddling layers of identity that most people can't even begin to understand. She's Black, she's transgender, she lives with cerebral palsy, yet she never let any label define her limitations. In fact, she turned them upside down and turned them into her strength. Erin didn't enter the modeling world through the usual doors. She threw them open. When she was signed by Elite Model Management at just 17, she didn't just make history. She challenged an industry that had long ignored people like her. She didn't ask for space. She took it. For herself, and for all the Black, queer, and disabled kids who are standing on the sidelines thinking, there's no place for me. But here's the thing. Erin's impact goes beyond glossy magazine covers and runway lights. She's not just a model of clothes. She's a model of courage. She's a model of what it means to own your story, even with scars. She shows us that visibility isn't just about being seen, it's about being understood. And she makes it clear that diversity without true inclusion is just a performance. What I find most moving about Erin personally is that she doesn't sugarcoat the fight. She speaks directly about pain, rejection, medical barriers, gender dysphoria, and loneliness. She's honest and direct. And that's exactly why people listen. Because in a world full of filters, Erin brings us the truth. And the truth is healing. She's constantly lifting others up on social media, in interviews, in the classroom. She's advocating for disabled creators. She's educating brands. She's cheering on trans youth trying to survive in today's climate. She's not here to beg for pity. She's building bridges. Think of the courage it takes to come out as a minority, to face disability, discrimination, racism, and transphobia every day and still show up with joy, with style, with brilliance. It's the kind of courage that not only changes lives, it transforms cultures. Erin reminds us that your body, your gender, your skin, your wheelchair, none of it makes you any less worthy of honor. She's rewriting the rules of beauty and power in real time. And maybe that's the legacy we all need to strive for. One where success isn't about fitting in, but about standing out as your authentic self. So if you've ever felt like you had to shrink to be accepted or hide a part of yourself just to belong, let Erin Phillip remind you, you're not here to be small. You're here to take up space. Loud, beautiful, unapologetically. And if she can do it on crutches, in front of a camera, under the weight of 1,000 expectations, then trust me, you can too. Don't just celebrate Erin. Spread the word. Make sure her story doesn't get buried under the next trend. Because the world needs more Erins. More courage, more honesty, more bold, beautiful truths. These 10 voices are not just game changers, they are life-changing. They show us what it means to live fully, love fully, and lead with truth. Being gay, being Black, being yourself in a world that tries to constrain you, it takes courage. But every person we met today proves one thing: authenticity is powerful. And presence, it saves lives. If you recognize yourself in any of the stories here, hold on to it, share it, talk about it, and most importantly, keep showing up as your authentic self. Leave a comment below who inspires you the most, like, share, and subscribe if you believe in a world where everyone is free. You are not alone, you have never been alone, and here, we celebrate every part of you. See you next time. Stay proud, stay true, and stay strong. What if the Black stars you idolized growing up spent their lives afraid to love openly? The voices that shaped music, the faces that reshaped Hollywood, the men who made you laugh, cry, and dream big. For decades, they smiled on stage, posed for the camera, played the roles the world wanted them to, all the while hiding a truth so dangerous at the time that it could have destroyed their careers overnight. Their stories are more complicated, more heartbreaking, and more powerful than the headlines ever made. And by the end of this video, you may never listen to their songs or watch their movies the same way again. When we talk about the birth of rock and roll, we talk about Little Richard. He didn't just sing, he set the stage on fire. With every scream, every piano smash, every jewel-encrusted suit, he pushed boundaries in ways no one else dared. Millions of fans idolized him, copied his look, stole his sound, and built entire careers around the musical blueprint he created. But there's one thing they rarely talk about, something the industry, and even Little Richard himself, spent their lives trying to erase: his sexuality. Little Richard wasn't just closeted, he was locked in a constant battle between desire and denial. From an early age, he knew he was different. Growing up in Macon, Georgia, in the 1930s and 40s, being black was dangerous. But being black and gay, it was a sentence society would not forgive. Richard's strict religious upbringing had drilled into him one thing: homosexuality was a sin. His father, a church deacon by day and nightclub owner by night, rejected him for being weak, kicked him out of the house when he was just a teenager. Imagine being 15, broke, homeless, and carrying the burden of feeling like God, your family, and the world were against you. But Richard had one weapon: his music. And when fame finally came, with it came a strange kind of freedom and an even stranger kind of cage. On stage, he could be flamboyant, wear makeup, scream sexually suggestive lyrics, and the world would applaud him. But as soon as the music stopped, the mask would be put back on. Being queer-coded was one thing. Being openly gay in the 1950s music industry, that was career suicide. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when he would speak his truth. In candid interviews, he would laugh about his wild days with men, about the orgies and the nightlife, about sneaking around with lovers his fans would never know about. But then, almost like clockwork, the shame would set in. He would continue his religious tirades, openly condemn homosexuality, call it unnatural, and claim to be saved all over again. This back and forth not only confused fans, it was emotionally devastating for Richard himself. He went through periods of self-loathing, throwing away personal belongings that reminded him of past relationships, dropping friends, cutting ties with people who loved him for who he was. All because, deep down, he believed that God would never forgive him for being gay. But the world kept watching, keeping buying records, keeping cheering for the wild man of rock and roll, never knowing the full price he was paying inside. By the time the LGBTQ+ movement gained real momentum, little Richard was older, tired, and still unwilling or unable to fully embrace the label that had defined him in his private life for so long. When he died in 2020, tributes poured in from around the world. Musicians, fans, and even LGBTQ+ activists celebrated him as a queer icon. But the saddest truth? Richard never got to live his full, authentic self in public. Not even in the final chapters of his life. And here's the frustrating part. If someone as powerful, influential, groundbreaking as little Richard felt unable to come out, how many others are still hiding to this day? Let us know what you think in the comments below. When we talk about voices that shook American society, James Baldwin stands in a class of his own. A literary genius, a fearless civil rights advocate, and a man whose words still resonate in classrooms, protests, and political speeches today. But behind his sharp intellect and fearless commentary on race and injustice, Baldwin carried a personal pain: his struggles as a black gay man in America. Born in Harlem in 1924, Baldwin grew up under the strict supervision of a devoutly religious stepfather, a preacher who believed that fear and discipline were the tools to keep a boy on the right path. But even as a child, Baldwin knew he didn't fit that mold. His love of literature, his sensitivity, and his attraction to other boys set him apart from an early age. The church was both a refuge and a prison. By his teenage years, he knew that who he was would never be accepted within those walls, or outside, on the streets of 1940s America, where being black and gay was a double sentence. So Baldwin left. In the late 1940s, he flew to Paris in pursuit of freedom and breathing room. For the first time, he found a place where he could exist more openly, at least than he had at home. But the thing is, even in Paris, Baldwin rarely labeled himself. He wrote about homosexual desire, male love, isolation, and longing with revolutionary honesty. His 1956 novel, Giovanni's Room, is now a classic of gay literature. But back then, it almost cost him his career. Publishers warned him. Writing about homosexual love would alienate black readers and everyone else. But Baldwin, never one to follow the rules, published it anyway. And while critics praised the book, it also fueled speculation about his personal life. That's where things got complicated. Baldwin never stood on a podium and shouted, "I'm gay." No interviews, no public essays asserting that label. Instead, he let his characters speak for him. Their pain, their longing, their anger became his silent confession. And at a time when coming out could ruin your career, or worse, it was an act of defiance. His friends and writing colleagues knew, his lovers knew, his colleagues in Paris and New York knew. But to the public, Baldwin remained a brilliant, enigmatic writer who spoke about race but remained silent about the details of his heart. Even near the end, as the LGBTQ+ movement grew, Baldwin eschewed labels. He once said, "I've always believed that labels are dangerous. I'd rather not be called anything at all." But for many Black LGBTQ+ artists today, Baldwin is more than a literary icon. He is a symbol of survival. Proof that even when the world tries to erase you, your voice and legacy can still transcend. So what do you think? Was Baldwin's silence about his sexuality, fear, or quiet rebellion? Let us know in the comments, because this conversation still matters. When Luther Vandross sang about love, millions believed he was singing directly to them. With every lyric, every note, he captured longing, hope, heartbreak, and passion, in a way few artists could. Hits like Never Too Much and Dance With My Father became timeless anthems, played at weddings, family gatherings, and lonely nights. But behind that soothing voice and those soulful love songs, Luther carried a secret heavier than any heartbreak he ever sang about: his sexuality. Born in New York City in 1951, Luther grew up surrounded by music, but also by expectations. In the R&B world of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, being a black male singer meant being masculine, sexy, and above all, heterosexual. Record labels marketed him as the dream man of millions of female fans. And Luther lived up to that. In interviews, he dodged every personal question about relationships, never confirming, never denying, just smiling, redirecting the conversation, and letting fans imagine whatever story they wanted. But how long could a person live like that, without falling apart inside? Behind the scenes, friends, colleagues, and industry insiders knew the truth. Luther was gay, and he lived with the constant fear that coming out would destroy the career he had worked so hard to build. One of his closest friends, singer Patti LaBelle, later revealed that Luther feared losing his female fan base. He was terrified that the women who clung to his every love song would leave him as soon as they learned the truth. And perhaps even more heartbreaking, he worried about what his mother would think. His family's acceptance weighed heavily on him, perhaps even more than the public. Bruce Vilanch, a writer and friend of Hollywood, once recalled Luther describing his double life. In public, he was the epitome of love songs. In private, he carried the pain of isolation, secrets, and self-denial. Do you think, in a different era, with a different industry, Luther would have found the courage to live openly? Luther never married, never had a public relationship with a woman, and never let his fans know his truth. Even as HIV and AIDS ravaged the Black LGBTQ community in the 80s and 90s, Luther remained silent, carefully navigating a world that refused to let Black men, especially famous ones, live authentically. His health struggles only deepened the mystery. After a devastating stroke in 2003, Luther stopped making public appearances. And in 2005, the world lost one of the greatest voices in music history. It wasn't until after his death, friends and industry insiders, that the truth many suspected was quietly acknowledged. His voice told the world how to love. But in his own life, he sang those songs from behind a wall. A wall built by fear, by the pressures of the industry, and by a society that wasn't ready for men like him to live their lives to the fullest. And that's perhaps the most heartbreaking legacy of all. The man who gave millions the soundtrack to their love stories never got the chance to write his own. Richard Pryor was a man who made the world laugh at its ugliest realities. Addiction, racism, domestic violence, poverty, the things most people run from. Pryor ran straight for putting them on stage and daring America to look. He stripped comedy to its core, told stories that made people uncomfortable, and still made them laugh. But there was one subject, a dark corner of his life, that even Pryor couldn't wrap up in a joke: his sexuality. Born in 1940 in Peoria, Illinois, Richard grew up in chaos. His grandmother ran a brothel. His earliest memories? Violence, prostitution, addiction, and survival. As a teenager, he saw things most grown men never saw. And while other boys were learning how to date girls, Richard learned how to hide, how to distract, how to weaponize humor to hide the parts of himself that felt too dangerous to express. On stage, Pryor was fearless. He joked about everything, even his own near-death experiences, even the darkest corners of his drug use, even setting himself on fire in a freebase accident. But whenever the subject of sex and identity came up, he turned it into something else. A joke, a distraction, a joke designed to distract. In some of his stand-up routines, Pryor hinted at being with men. The comments were swift. The stories were told with a smirk and a wink, leaving the audience guessing, is he serious? Or is this just Richard being outrageous again? And maybe that was the goal, keeping it vague enough. So no one really knew. But here's the heartbreaking part. He was serious. In private, close friends knew the truth. In his diaries, Pryor wrote openly about his attraction to men, his experiences, his confusion, and his shame. For him, it wasn't about identity labels, it was about survival, and the overwhelming fear that if the public knew, it would all fall apart. And in 1980s America, for a black comedian at the height of his fame, those fears were not unfounded. Then came the revelation that no one saw coming. Years after Pryor's death, music mogul Quincy Jones accidentally dropped a bombshell in an interview, suggesting that Richard Pryor had a romantic and sexual relationship with none other than Marlon Brando. The media exploded. Fans were stunned. The internet was awash with headlines. But the one who confirmed it with quiet certainty was Pryor's widow, Jennifer Lee Pryor. She said Richard was not ashamed, not in private. He joked about it with friends, wrote about it in his diary. It was just something the rest of the world was never allowed to know. And perhaps that is the real tragedy here. For a man who built his entire career on radical honesty, who bared his soul night after night to millions of strangers, Richard Pryor still died with much of himself locked away. Can you imagine how exhausting that must be? Standing under bright lights, making the world laugh, while inside you're drowning in silence? Some say the reason Pryor pushed himself so hard, living so recklessly, burned so many bridges, it was because deep down he never believed he deserved peace, or love, or even forgiveness. And maybe that's why. When we watch his old comedy shows now, and hear him joke about sex, those laughs, they sound a little different, a little sadder, like a man laughing just to keep from crying. When Johnny Mathis sang about love, it felt like love that transcended time, soft, innocent, and universal. For generations, couples have slow danced to his voice. Weddings, anniversaries, first dates. His songs have become the soundtrack to millions of love stories. But the truth, most of those fans never knew at the time. While Johnny Mathis was transmitting the language of love to the world, he was not allowed to speak publicly about his own love. Born in 1935 in Gilmer, Texas, and raised in San Francisco, Johnny was a natural performer from an early age. By the late 1950s, he was a household name. His ballads were topping the charts, his face was on magazine covers, and millions of women dreamed of being the one Johnny sang for. But who was Johnny really? He lived quietly, privately, and yes, as a gay man. In an era when even the rumor of homosexuality could end a career overnight, Johnny chose to remain silent, not out of shame, but out of self-preservation and perhaps out of wisdom. Have you ever wondered how many artists of that era made the same choice? Not because they wanted to hide, but because they wanted to survive? Mathis never staged dramatic denials. He never played the tabloid game. He simply refused to discuss his personal life. But in 1982, something changed. In an interview with Us magazine, Mathis casually, almost accidentally, admitted that he was gay. The industry, the media, they weren't ready. The article was buried, the world moved on, and Mathis went back to doing what he did best: singing, performing, and minding his own business. It wasn't until decades later, when conversations about LGBTQ+ became more open, fans and journalists came back. asking, why don't we talk about this more? Why isn't Johnny Mathis celebrated as one of the first black celebrities to come out? His answer was as gentle as his music. He says he never felt the need to make a big statement, that his sexuality was just a part of who he was, not a headline, not a scandal, not a marketing tool. And in a way, that quiet dignity became his rebellion. At a time when the world wanted drama, Johnny gave it grace. When others felt compelled to lie, he simply chose not to say anything. Today, looking back, Mathis is both a pioneer and a reminder. Coming out looks different to everyone. For some, it's a front-page story. For others, it's a gentle confession, wrapped in a melody. Only those who really listen will hear it. And maybe that's what Johnny Mathis is most about. Before Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, before the words "I have a dream" were immortalized, Bayard Rustin was an activist. Bayard was more than an activist. He was the architect behind the entire 1963 March on Washington. Every bus route, every volunteer list, every speaker lineup, Bayard built it all, piece by piece, knowing he would never be the face of it. And why? Because Bayard Rustin was openly gay. At a time when being black was a battle for survival, being black and gay, it was a double whammy, a risk the movement was unwilling to take. Born in 1912 in Westchester, Pennsylvania, Bayard spent decades fighting for justice long before King became a household name. From the early labor movements to the anti-segregation protests, he was always on the front lines. But as his influence grew, so did the whispers. His 1953 arrest on morals charges after being caught with another man became a weapon for both the FBI and the political enemies of the civil rights movement. Leaders feared that Rustin's sexuality would be used to discredit everything they stood for. Even in King's inner circle, some pushed to sideline him. Some wanted him gone altogether. Can you imagine that choice? Pour your heart and soul into a freedom movement and then be told your love life is a burden? But Bayard didn't leave. Instead, he worked harder. He moved from the spotlight into the background, quietly directing, building, and strategizing, without applause, without recognition, and without the recognition he deserved. There's a certain kind of pain that comes from being essential, yet invisible. Bayard carried that pain for years. Even after the success of the March on Washington, Bayard's name still didn't make headlines. History books barely mentioned him. TV interviews were rarely called. While others became icons, Bayard became a footnote. But even so, he never stopped fighting. For voting rights, for labor unions, for anti-war causes, and later in life, for LGBTQ+ equality. One of his last battles was for the rights of openly gay people, long before it was politically acceptable. It wasn't until 2013, 26 years after his death, Bayard Rustin finally received national recognition. President Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, calling him one of the greatest unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. Looking back, you have to ask yourself, how many Bayard Rustins are there in history? Men and women who fought for justice but had to hide sacrifice or step aside simply for the people they loved. Bayard believed in equality for all. He fought not just for his race, but for humanity, even when humanity wasn't ready to fight for him. His legacy, it's written between the lines of every speech, every march, and every right that we now take for granted. While most artists of the 1970s tried to fit in, Sylvester made his career by standing out. In an era of glitter balls and dance floors, he was more than just a disco voice. He was a statement, a challenge to convention, and for many, a living revolution in high heels. From the moment he stepped on stage, Sylvester James Jr. didn't just perform, he existed, loudly, unapologetically, and beautifully odd. Born in Los Angeles in 1947, Sylvester grew up singing in church choirs, a space where his powerful falsetto first attracted attention and where, ironically, he first learned that being himself came at a price. When he moved to San Francisco, he had no interest in fitting in anymore. The makeup, the sequins, the genderless fashion, everything about Sylvester exuded authenticity. And then, in the same breath, you could sense the loneliness beneath the glitter. When he sang "You Make Me Feel Mighty Real," it wasn't just a disco anthem, it was a statement. Quirky love, quirky existence, quirky joy deserves attention. But being openly gay and black in the music industry of the 1970s, it was dangerous territory. Radio stations refused to play his songs in certain markets. Promoters were hesitant to book him. Record labels didn't know how to package him. There were nights when Sylvester performed for thousands and still went home, wondering if mainstream America would ever truly embrace him. Can you imagine giving the world your voice, your truth, and still being told you're too much? But if there's one thing Sylvester never did, it was shut himself away from anyone. He used his fame to elevate the LGBTQ+ community, advocate for gay rights, perform at Pride events, and then, when the HIV/AIDS crisis hit, become one of the first black celebrities to speak out. When Sylvester was diagnosed with HIV in the mid-80s, he knew what it meant. He'd seen his friends fall ill one by one. He knew how the media portrayed people like him, as cautionary tales, as the statistics show. But even then, Sylvester was still on stage, keeping singing, keeping loving, and still fighting. In the final months of his life, as his health was failing, he made one final request. Royals from his music should go directly to HIV/AIDS charities in San Francisco. Even in death, he wanted to leave something meaningful behind, something bigger than fame. Sylvester died in 1988 at just 41. But decades later, his voice still echoes across dance floors. His legacy lives on in every queer artist, every drag artist, every person who refuses to apologize for taking up space. And perhaps that's the question we should all be asking ourselves. How many lives did Sylvester save, just by existing, without remorse? Because sometimes, just being yourself is the loudest act of protest. If you've ever been captivated by the sound of a Duke Ellington classic, chances are you've been moved by the genius of Billy Strayhorn. His melodies, light yet complex, his harmonies, rich yet subtle. Strayhorn wasn't just a composer, he was the invisible architect behind some of jazz's most timeless works. Take the A Train, that was him. Lush Life, that was him too. But while his music echoed through clubs and concert halls, Billy Strayhorn himself remained behind. Not by accident, by survival. In the 1940s and 50s, being black in the music industry was a struggle enough. Being black and openly gay? That was career suicide. Unlike many of his peers, however, Strayhorn never tried to hide who he was. He didn't play the straight man. He didn't pretend to have relationships with women for photo ops. In his tight-knit circle, everyone knew. Billy loved men. And he made no apologies for it. But what's heartbreaking is how the industry treated him. Duke Ellington, though forever grateful for Strayhorn's brilliance, rarely acknowledged him publicly. Billy's name was often not on the record covers, his photos were rarely published. His interviews? Hardly. And part of that was the times they lived in. Jazz was already a racially charged space. Adding an openly gay black man to the spotlight, it was a risk few labels, or even Ellington himself, would take. But Strayhorn stayed, loyal, silent, pouring his heartache, his isolation, and yes, his secret love into his music. Have you ever listened to Lush Life late at night? The longing, the exhaustion, the pain of secret love. It's all there. Every note, every pause, every lyric, a coded confession for those who care to listen. Strayhorn's relationships were often private, fleeting, and lived in the shadows. But among friends, he was open. He brought his boyfriend to rehearsals, hold hands when he wanted to. In his own quiet way, Billy lived authentically, long before the world made room for men like him. Sadly, that world never really came into his life. Billy Strayhorn died in 1967 at just 51 of esophageal cancer. At his funeral, Duke Ellington finally said it out loud, calling him my right hand, my left hand, the eyes in my head, the brain of my heart. It was a beautiful tribute, but for many LGBTQ+ fans, it also felt too little, too late. Today, Strayhorn's legacy is being restored. His songs are being studied, celebrated, and finally his truth is being told. Because behind every iconic tune is a man, loving, longing, and living in a world that never saw him fully. To most Americans, Paul Winfield was the epitome of strength. A leading black actor in Hollywood who, let's be honest, didn't have many leading roles for men who looked like him. His performance in Sounder earned him an Academy Award nomination. His portrayal of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the King miniseries captivated audiences. On screen, Paul was everything the industry wanted him to be: classy, masculine, and above all, marketable. But behind the camera, aside from awards shows and red carpets, Paul Winfield lived a very different story. A story he never dared to share with the public. In 1970s and 1980s Hollywood, being an openly gay black man wasn't just risky, it was career-ending. Studios expected their male stars to exude heterosexual charm, to flirt in interviews, to show up at events with hand-picked female co-stars on their arms. Paul played along. At one point, he even publicly dated his Sounder co-star Cicely Tyson, a move that many later saw as damage control. But the truth was, Paul's heart was elsewhere. For more than 30 years, he was in a serious relationship with Charles Gillen Jr., an architect, a man who was not very well known in Hollywood. Their love was real, steady, quiet, and like so many other same-sex relationships of the era, it was done behind closed doors, out of fear, but never out of lack of love. Paul's close friends knew it. Industry insiders whispered it. But to the public, he was just another eligible bachelor, another Hollywood heartthrob who hadn't found the right woman. Have you ever wondered how exhausting it must have been? To build an entire career, to stand on stage and accept an award, knowing that the person who mattered most couldn't stand next to you in the spotlight. In 2002, when Charles died of cancer, those who knew Paul say he was never the same again. The man who had always held on to his public image began to withdraw. His health rapidly declined. Just 2 years later, in 2004, Paul Winfield died of a heart attack. And it wasn't until after both of their deaths that the full truth about their relationship became known to the public. There was no scandal, there was no exposure, just quiet acknowledgement from friends, and the bitter realization that Hollywood had lost not just a leading man, but a man. Like so many others who had spent his life loving in silence. Today, when we look back at Paul's career and the roles that made his name, there's something poetic and heartbreaking in knowing that the strength he displayed on screen was often a mask, hiding the vulnerability he lived with every day. And now, we come to the last name on our list. A man known to millions as the loud, bold, fast-talking George Jefferson, but almost no one knows the real Sherman Hemsley. For more than a decade, Sherman Hemsley lit up American living rooms as the star of The Jeffersons. He played a self-made businessman, a proud, sharp-tongued black man who wasn't afraid to speak his mind. In real life, fans assumed he was just as bold, confident, outspoken. But the truth? It couldn't be further from the truth. In real life, Sherman was incredibly shy, soft-spoken, very reserved. While his character told jokes and made headlines, Sherman himself quietly retreated from the spotlight, doing everything he could to keep one part of his life private, his sexuality. Unlike many of his Hollywood peers, Sherman never gave interviews about his dating life, never brought a partner to public events, never even reported on romantic relationships. For years, the tabloids had little to no information about, because Sherman kept his private life more private than most. Some close friends say he never even discussed it behind closed doors, not out of shame, but out of fear, fearing that coming out as gay would ruin the career he had built. And worse, erase the groundbreaking image of George Jefferson, one of the first successful and powerful black characters on American television. Throughout the 70s and 80s, being black and famous was subject to endless scrutiny. Being black, famous, and gay? That seemed like a risk Sherman couldn't take. So he remained single in public, lived alone, rarely attended industry parties, and while fans laughed at his on-screen ostentation, few realized that the man behind the character commuted home every night to silence. After The Jeffersons ended, Sherman continued to act, taking smaller roles, but never stepped into the spotlight that required interviews about his personal life. Even as rumors circulated for decades, Sherman never confirmed, never denied. Just smiled, gave brief answers, and changed the subject. It wasn't until 2012 when Sherman Hemsley died of lung cancer, the truth, which many insiders had known for years, quietly emerged. Actor Garrett Morris, his longtime friend and colleague, publicly confirmed that Sherman was gay, but chose, until the very last minute, to keep that part of himself away from the cameras, away from fans, and in many ways, away from himself. Reflecting on Sherman's story, it's hard not to wonder, how would his life have been different if he had felt safe enough to live fully? With every laugh, with every catchphrase, with every iconic TV moment, there was a man, sitting quietly at home, living with a secret the world wasn't ready to hear. And perhaps that's the hardest truth of all. Sometimes the people who make us laugh the hardest are the ones who carry the heaviest silence. And that's our list. 10 black men who shaped music, comedy, movies, and history, but spent their lives hiding a simple truth. Some, like Sylvester and Bayard Rustin, lived boldly. Others, like Luther Vandross and Paul Winfield, stayed silent to survive. And some, like Little Richard and Richard Pryor, walked the painful line between insinuation and concealment. Their stories remind us of how far we've come, and how far we still have to go. Which story has stayed with you the most? Leave your thoughts below, like, subscribe, and join us next time for more untold stories that matter. Thanks for watching.